Hey there, folks. It's Goldie here with another episode of Marvelous Mythology, and today we're going to be going over something near and dear to my heart, which would be skeletons. Now, mythologically speaking, skeletons have been around since the dawn of history. People have dedicated entire cults to the skull, to basically anything else we can imagine, but sometimes it's just really nice to go over things and see what we've got going. So, just like our goblin video, the way that we're going to be structuring this is first looking at them from a historical perspective and how they influenced mythology and where it comes to today, especially in terms of things like books and video games, before we touch on to one of my favorite topics, which is D&D and writing and how we can implement them in media going forward. I would like to note that the symbolism of skeletons is often this idea of death and the acceptance of it and moving on. There's entire art movements called Dance Macabre that I'm really happy to say celebrates death, as well as there's a lot of things from Mexican culture, like the Day of the Dead, that is just really beautiful in its own right. Unfortunately, today I want to focus more on undead skeletons in the form of, how we look at them in video games today. I would love to eventually get into the celebration aspect of it, but that one is unfortunately not going to be as widespread as the rest of the video. Historically speaking, the skeleton is euphemism with death itself. It has been around in most European and Asiatic cultures, along with Africa and the Americas, since basically the perception of civilization itself. Burial rituals and human societies have gone back ages, and we look at them today as they're very taboo to worship skeletons. But in many ways, you could argue that the dead are still iconographied in things such as Jesus on the cross, as well as there's just a number of fantasy religions. I mean, as far as Baldur's Gate 3 goes, the Trinity of Three shows a skull on the front of it, which shows that identification of the skeleton itself. So, historically speaking, one of the first influences that I have found when it comes to it is the cult of the skull, which I wouldn't really call them skeletons in the way that we look at them, but they are definitely useful to look at. Skipping ahead a bit, in the Bronze Age, societies like the Greeks really enjoyed the concept of skeletons and the ideas of their gods. Egyptians would do the same thing, except as we know, Egyptians are much more in line with the idea of mummification. Now, the Greeks liked skeletons and the idea that spirits who were malnourished of morality would oftentimes be depicted as skeletons, which I've always found to be a really interesting side tangent there. In European times, that you get into like the medieval era and where they would dominate a lot of the popular consensus of history in the West, skeletons are very prevalent when times of mass struggle occurs. They are this personification of death. Even biblically speaking, we look at a pale rider. Could be a skeleton, could be an emaciated corpse. There are multiple depictions of it throughout the historical record of the Bible and the many changes in it. So, Europeans oftentimes like this idea of a Grim Reaper, and this comes down to basically a sanctified skeleton shrouded in a robe or an armor of some kind, oftentimes depicted with a spear or a scythe, which are both heavily dependent on the time period you have. So, in times of war, the Reaper would usually carry a spear because spears are seen as a very important weapon on the battlefield, but I have a whole video about that you can go watch. Versus in times of struggle and strife, like a famine or sickness, he would oftentimes be depicted with a scythe. This is also why a lot of depictions of the Grim Reaper have this shadowy haze, which could be aligned with pestilence itself, because quite honestly, they use it as a very ubiquitous way. Now, skeletons were also seen as a very comical thing during the art depictions of it. They're dancing a lot, they're really, they're having a merry time, and it's really one of those that it's like, at least the disease is having a fun time in these, and I really do enjoy that aspect of the medieval period because it's almost like that satire comes through. So, moving on, we start to get a lot of depictions in Victorian times of skeletons because of the tuberculosis crisis and people trying to glorify that. Moving back a bit into time into Asia, because I feel like they have one of the better depictions of mythology that revolves around skeletons, I want to take time to talk about the giant boy, or the Okapokoro. Now, I think this thing is one of the coolest things ever. It's just an amalgamation of skeletons put together to smack things. It's a great example of a yokai, and one day me and my wife are going to sit down and actually talk about them because she's taking classes on Japanese history, so this would be a lot better up her alley. In the World Wars, skeletons are depicted a lot in art forms and media with propaganda because of the idea that there is, in World War I, a lot of chemical warfare and trying to depict it as evil, and in World War II, the US as well as the UK and Germany would use the depiction of skeletons both to iconographize their own forces by saying they are bringers of death or bringers of justice, as well as you would see the resurgence of a lot of us versus them logic with skeletons. I think this is actually where a lot of undead skeleton lore as we know it today comes from, is these times, as well as operations in Vietnam, which were basically trying to make spirits look real through using basically like social engineering and psychological warfare. Now getting into the modern period, skeletons have kind of adopted this idea of the henchman vibe. They are not the main antagonists typically in a story. Instead, they usually take up the whole of the space of a character's time trying to take them out to get to the big guy. I think skeletons are a unique fantasy trope that we find ourselves bringing back from the olden times of horror stories. This whole idea of a campfire skeleton or brittle bones, something that you can use, like the Okapokoro, to scare people from going out at night when they're not supposed to. These are all things that seem childish in nature when we look back, and yet we play games and enjoy things that have them just as much as we do with goblins. I think that skeletons have the limelight of being one of the better enemies you can throw at people when you want a level of humanity to them. In many ways, we are all just skeletons waiting to be strewn across a battlefield to be reanimated by a necromancer. We are all just a story that has been reduced to nothing more than the atmospheric cinematics of what's left behind. I think that the atmospheric lore that Fallout uses skeletons with is especially good, and in Skyrim even, you get to see them in such a way that you can even reanimate them and see what they were like sort of in life. I think that skeletons as a whole are an identityless form of humanity that we could say, huh, they existed, they had a life, and they had history to them. And that makes them really good at being versatile. You could have skeleton wizards, you can have skeleton knights, you can have skeleton berserkers. But I really think that the best use of skeletons is possibly with archers. We'll be going over that a lot more in the D&D segment. So I think that the modern interpretation of the skeleton is to be a lesser powered enemy until we get up to things like wraiths, liches, and all of that fun stuff. They are an easily produced undead in video games that can be mass-produced and mass-used with limited intelligence but evil intent. I think that D&D has them set best. They're basically just malicious creatures that they serve a master, and their end goal is to cause pain and torment to as many people besides other skeletons. I think that this makes them a rather unique force on the battlefield, because if you put a couple of them in some plate mail armor and put them up on a hill with some archers, you've basically got a good time in itself. So it's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about skeletons in modern media that we look at the historical culture that they come from. No two skeletons are going to be the same. I mean, you might have one skeleton that's from the Ottoman Empire rocking their perspective attire with their perspective weapons, versus a bunch of, say, Revolutionary War skeletons that are going to be fighting with cannons and line infantry. These are all things that you should consider when you are trying to build your skeletons and trying to use them in lore. And I jump to here now because it's really important talking about the cultural generation of skeletons, that we do keep in mind the cultures that exist there. It's really easy to say that there's no culture and it's just a bland skeleton, but I think even down to how they swing a sword should have some kind of memory of what they were in life, because anything can be a skeleton. Now, I don't want to talk too much about like the first video games, the first films, or anything where skeletons are seen that would belong to Disney, and I honestly think the first playable skeleton was from Medieval, but I could be wrong there. What I do want to talk about is the idea of using skeletons in your Dungeons and Dragons settings or your writing settings as something more than just an average henchman. Because I think that more than just being a bunch of mindless undead that rove the land looking to kill things, they could be pretty good gatekeepers and, crypt keepers, kind of like how the Draugr are in Skyrim. You can use these skeletons as a force of defense or protection. I know that I've seen some settings where you basically form entire armies of skeletons in order to subvert the need to fight with living people. This lowers the death count significantly. But moreover, it's this idea of what would it be like for you to be ripped back into some form of sentience hundreds of years potentially after your life just to serve as a bony boy for a couple of days. I think that that's a really, really interesting idea lorically and probably could build a lot of characters off of that. Now, you could go off of some pretty wild things with skeletons. At the end of the day, they can be wizards, they can be rangers, they can be paladins, they can basically do anything you want them to. But it really boils down to if they themselves are going to just be cannon fodder for your setting, or if you want them to actually be pretty scary. Because skeletons are resistant to anything besides hammers, mostly, if I'm not mistaken. Which makes bludgeoning weapons your best bet, and if you're an archer trying to be in a one-on-one fight with a skeletal archer up a hill, you're already having a bad day. So I think mixing them with enemies that would also benefit from this, like, goblins, ambushers, or, hobgoblin fighters, some minotaur chargers, any of that, you could really make encounters and scenarios where your characters are a lot more driven back than simply, oh, it's an endless horde of skeletons. They're basically the B1 battle droid of our setting. Which, sure, they can be. They could definitely be that for you. But skeletons are innately prone to be something more if you allow them to be. So, what should you arm skeletons with? What should you give them? Well, I think that their culture matters a lot here. If you're going to have a bunch of skeletons from the Greek period, it would make sense that they have Bronze Age weapons and armor. Maybe their spellcasting is reserved for things that were down to the domains of the gods they worshipped. Maybe they don't have magical weapons. Maybe if they do have magical weapons, they're not the type that we would consider useful today. I know that in Baldur's Gate 3, we see a lot of skeletons being armed with minor weapons and things. I really don't think that's the right way either. Just giving them rusted equipment isn't going to do well. A skeleton is a reusable asset that can just keep being raised back up and back up and back up, and once it's not useful anymore, it's bone dust. So you could completely make a setting where you have a reusable plate mail knight army completely comprised of skeletons. It's far cheaper on your magic system than making a bunch of suits of animated armor. That being said, as players go, I think skeletons, especially things like skeletal horses or skeletal birds, are especially potent creatures to be on your side. They're basically unkillable companions that can work as spies or pack mules, that could work as mounts and keep you going, as well as they add a certain amount of flavor text. Maybe some people don't like the idea of undead zombies, vampires, ghasts, and all of that, but they're not quite as concerned with skeletons because maybe their culture reveres skeletons. I mean, it's not so far-fetched. We have it today. So why not in a fantasy setting? Now, I think some of the more wilder things I've seen is like the hazard suits in Fallout's Big Empty DLC, because the Big Empty really does give you this basically just a skeleton in a suit that is keeping it preserved and fighting, and that is just... that's a whole level of wonky I'm not sure I'm ready to deal with. I guess what I'm trying to say with skeletons, if we're going to look at the mythology of them and why I think they're misunderstood, is that they are oftentimes fodder or just this evil creature roving around and beating the crap out of people for no other reason than to torment them. This is fine in a setting where you want them to do that, but maybe they could be more than that. Maybe they're the undead druid skeleton that is kept alive by nature in order to preserve the land still and do their routes. Maybe it is warriors who, in death, swear service to the kingdom, even in times of great war, so that their bodies come back and they fight for a bit. There's so much more we can do with them than simply, oh, we throw a bunch of naked skeletons at you with swords. And I really do challenge you to use your imagination and cultural likes and ideas to really influence them. Hell, maybe you have a bunch of skeletal crusaders running around with catapults and arbalasks. That would be super interesting. Maybe you have a bunch of undead janissaries that are all skeletal. It really does just give you something that you can throw in any setting because they don't have many environmental weaknesses. Keep in mind, radiant damage sucks, and you can blow them apart with explosives pretty easily, but really, how easy are those to get in your setting if you really want them to be hard to get? So I guess to end this off, because I think that we're getting close to that point, I hope that skeletons are an interesting source of lore for you, because as the old adage goes, there is something in them for all of us. We're all going to become one, because we're all just the dried bones waiting to happen on history's doorstep. Well, this is the end of the main content of the video, and where I'm going to stick in this final little bit for myself. So in the future, we're going to be trying to keep our videos at 20 minutes or under, just because YouTube likes to cut me off when I talk too much. And other than that, I just wanted to say the next video upload is going to be my bronze armor video, because it's going to be working out in a couple spots. I'm super happy to be able to do this, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much, and yeah, peace.